Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 11. In this chapter, some of the arguments for and against abortion revolve around when life, personhood, or the ascription of moral values begins. If the brain is used, again, as a guide, then the development of the brain is going to be crucial to this debate. There is a kind of stalemate affecting each of the positions, and currently some of the rights and freedoms established in the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade are being slowly whittled away. Abortion touches on some of the toughest moral issues of all, especially regarding when life begins and the values we give to lives. The competing interests of the right to life and a woman's right to choose are central to this abortion debate. The value of life principle versus the principle of individual freedom is really what's at root of the tension between the two positions on abortion. When does life begin, and when should it be protected? Extreme positions on each side support absolute arguments. So we're going to see the kind of extreme ends of the spectrum, and then we're also going to see a moderate position in today's lecture. A little bit about the history of abortion in American society. In the 1800s, abortion was generally tolerated. In the 1900s, abortion was banned in every single state. In 1973, the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade overturned the laws of each state that banned abortion. And the legal status of abortion in the United States today is based on the idea that abortion is legally permissible and morally permissible based on the trimester approach. So in the first trimester, abortion is permitted without exception. In the second trimester, abortion is permitted with some restrictions. And in the third trimester, abortion is prohibited except when the pregnancy causes a threat to the life or health of the mother. So, the big question, when does human life begin? One stance is that life is present from conception, from the moment that the sperm fertilizes the egg. But there may be different points at which such a life can be considered human. A second idea is that the conceptus passes through various stages of development, and the closer it gets to viability, the closer it gets to being a human. And it's difficult to state that at the earlier stages the life is fully human, but it's equally difficult to state that after week 12 that fetus is not an actual human life. Okay, taking on the position that abortion is morally impermissible. I'm going to try to stay away from the phrases pro-life and pro-choice because those phrases are morally loaded and question-begging, and we don't want to commit any fallacies in our reasoning. So we're going to try to stick to some more kind of neutral phrases for these two positions. So the position that abortion is morally impermissible argues that life begins at conception, and so abortion is the taking of a human life. The sanctity or value of life argument is, again, based on the idea that human life and human rights begin at conception, and so that the unborn innocent child should be afforded the protections that are granted to all of us human beings. And next we see the domino argument. And the idea here is that allowing abortion to happen will lead to a complete disregard for human life. And proponents of this argument point to Nazi genocide as an example of where we may end up if we allow the killing of innocent beings in cases of abortion. Now, the dangers of abortion to a mother's life. This camp argues that medically speaking, the medical procedures involved in abortion pose serious risk to women's health. And the textbook talks more in depth about the different kinds of abortion and the associated risks of each. So I'm not going to discuss that anymore here in lecture. But the psychological impact of abortion, according to the camp that thinks that abortion is morally impermissible, argues that women who have abortions feel high levels of guilt and suffer from lifelong emotional scars. And then this camp turns to the relative safety of pregnancy and argues that there are few medical risks posed by pregnancy because of the advancement of medical technology. and that if there is some kind of complication with pregnancy or labor and delivery, the view is that the goal should be to save the mother's life, but a strong second goal should be not to kill the fetus. And this argument works in a lot of first world countries. The kind of relative safety of pregnancy and labor and delivery is not true in a lot of second and third world countries. And we'll talk a little bit more about where the United States as a first world country kind of falls in to that spectrum. All right, so this camp also says that adoption is a viable option or viable alternative to abortion. And this camp kind of simply says that. We'll see the counter to this argument in a few moments. This camp also thinks that an innocent, unborn human life should take priority over economic considerations. There's public aid available to women who need assistance, and financial support should also be sought from the father of the child. This is a little bit easier said than done. In cases of rape, a woman might not know who the father of the child is, or that man could end up in jail or prison for having committed the rape, and so of course will not be in a position to financially support that offspring. Now, accepting responsibility for sexual activities is also an argument used by the camp that thinks that abortion is morally impermissible. And the idea here is that women are responsible for the decision to engage in sexual activity, and pregnancy is a known risk or known possible consequence of sex. And so women who kind of take that risk then have to go through the unplanned pregnancies that happen as a consequence. This argument really only makes sense if the sex is consensual and is a true choice of the woman. Next, we see the argument against abortion in cases of rape and incest. And this argument is that the destruction of an innocent human life is not justified in the event of rape or incest. And in this circumstance, the child could either be put up for adoption or placed in a government-run institution. This argument fails to take into consideration the poor state of a lot of the government-run institutions and foster care systems, but we'll talk about that in a moment also. Okay, moving on to the arguments in favor of a woman's right to choose. This argument states that a woman should have the right to choose an abortion without discrimination or criminalization of her choices. One argument is from the idea of kind of absolute bodily autonomy. And this argument says that, look, women should have absolute rights over their bodies, particularly when it comes to procreation. The idea here is that limiting a woman's option to either carry out a pregnancy or not is akin to society and men having control over her procreative life, which is simply unjust. So think about, from your perspective, if someone else got to decide whether you had a child or not, and when that happened, you would probably feel that your bodily autonomy had been violated. Now, birth as the beginning of human life is, so we saw one extreme for the abortion is morally impermissible camp. This is one extreme for the camp that thinks that abortion is morally permissible. And this extreme stance on the kind of other end of the spectrum says that human life does not exist and that human rights do not attach to a fetus until it is actually born, until it becomes a child. So the conceptus remains a part of the woman's body and does not have any rights until it is born. And so 1 minute before it's born, it has no rights. The moment it is born, it does have rights. And by this line of reasoning, an abortion is permissible at any stage of pregnancy. Now, I need to note, so that we are all on the same page, that this position is not the mainstream belief among proponents of a woman's right to choose. So this is the extreme position for this side. And And next we see the problem of unwanted or malformed children. And the argument states that only children who are planned for and genuinely wanted should be brought into this world. And abortion makes this choice possible. This camp says, look, adoption is really a poor solution. Going through 9 months of pregnancy, and it's really closer to 10 months. Full-term fetus is 40 weeks. So going through those 40 weeks of pregnancy and then going through labor and delivery and then giving up the child for adoption really does pose significant hardships for the mother. The woman may have to take time off of work for medical appointments, for pregnancy and labor and delivery complications, for recovery time. And then, of course, adopted children also sometimes face or suffer feelings of rejection. And so this may not really be a good option for them either. And that leads to kind of the lack of humane institutions. So the various government-run institutions and foster care for unwanted children are frequently poorly run, which leads to inhumane existence for these unwanted and handicapped children. And then, of course, there's the argument that abortion is relatively safe. And from the medical standpoint, abortions only become medically unsafe when they are either self-induced or performed by unqualified staff in unsanitary conditions. And so long as abortion remains legal, women can go to proper medical facilities and be treated by qualified staff. And as soon as abortion becomes illegal, that's when women try to self-induce miscarriages or go to people who do not have the training and do not have the kind of clean facilities and instruments in order to conduct a safe abortion. And psychologically speaking, there are some women who do not consider the conceptus to be a human being. Remember, at that first 1 or 2 weeks of pregnancy, the conceptus really is simply a clump of cells that resembles a tumor more than it resembles, a human being. And so there may not be a feeling of guilt after an abortion. And any guilt that there is can certainly be worked on through counseling. And the consequences of guilt, while certainly bad and potentially lifelong, are going to be less harmful than the consequences of raising an unwanted child or risking the health and mortality risks associated with pregnancy and labor and delivery. And then we also see a refutation of the domino argument. So the pro-choice movement asserts that there is no hard evidence that abortion leads to a general disregard for human life. And even if that were the case, there are still plenty of other laws protecting human life. Additionally, abortion is not mandatory. And there are laws protecting a woman's right to continue her pregnancy for all 40 weeks. So no one, if abortion is morally permissible and legally permissible, it's still not the case that a woman is going to be required to have an abortion. And with respect to the danger of pregnancy to the mother's life, in a scenario where a pregnant woman's life is at risk, her life should take precedence over the life of the unborn child. Now, in first world countries, in most first world countries, pregnancy has become much lower risk than in past decades, and certainly much lower risk than in second and third world countries. Unfortunately, in the United States, the risk of pregnancy to a woman's health and life are actually relatively high as compared to other first world countries. Our statistics for kind of the mortality rate associated with pregnancy and childbirth are closer to some third world countries than some of our peer first world countries. And so kind of this risk of pregnancy versus risk of abortion to the woman's life really depends on kind of which country we're talking about. With respect to the idea that abortion is morally permissible in cases of rape and incest, the view here is that abortion is at least going to be morally permissible in these cases, and it usually includes the idea that a woman should never be forced to go through with a pregnancy that's caused either by rape or incest. And that's partly because incest and rape are two of the most heinous crimes that could be committed against women. And so adding a forced pregnancy to these situations would simply add, kind of compound the harm that's already been done by the rape or the incest. And of course, people who think that abortion is morally permissible can also think that women and men should have to take responsibility for their sexual activities. Of course, people should take responsibility, and part of that responsibility should be the right to terminate an unplanned pregnancy. So this view agrees that women should take responsibility for their actions, but taking responsibility could include electing to have an abortion. Allowing pregnancy and childbirth as the only option for taking responsibility essentially punishes and discriminates against women by requiring them to carry all of the responsibility. Men carry very little of the responsibility because men cannot get pregnant. And lastly, here we see abortion as a woman's choice. An abortion solely involves a medical decision about a woman's body, what to be done to her body, and whether and how to go through childbirth. And this decision about her body should be left up to each individual woman without interference from outside parties. So again, we see the bodily autonomy argument. And then, of course, we have the moderate position. So we saw each end of the extreme end of the spectrum, and then now we're also going to look at a more moderate position. And this position allows for abortion in cases of rape and incest when the mother's life is in danger, and then also earlier during that first trimester of pregnancy. And the extreme positions of what are called the pro-life and pro-choice movements are really unresolvable. With this moderate position, however, there are no absolute rights. There are only strong rights. And human rights supersede the rights of all other interests and non-human animals. So looking at this problem of when human life begins and trying to synthesize that, given that there are these kind of various stages of gestation, the unanswered question is, when does the conceptus become a full human being entitled to the protections afforded to all of us who have already been born? Now, Daniel Callahan's view is that rights develop in a kind of continuous manner. So the closer you get to being born, the more fully human you become, and the more human rights attach to you. Cecilia Bach's view is that a conceptus does have value. So at that 1 or 2 week mark of pregnancy, when the conceptus really is a ball of cells that more resembles a tumor than a human, that has value, but there is a time frame during pregnancy when abortion is morally permissible. And also, Bach logically reminds us that providers do not have to participate. So if you are an OBGYN and you think that abortion is morally impermissible, you can simply opt out of treating women who want abortions, and you can choose to only treat women who want to carry their pregnancies full term. In summary, we see the argument from the standpoint that abortion is morally impermissible, and that argument is based largely on the value of life principle. And then counter to that is the idea that abortion is generally morally permissible, and that is built on the foundation of the principle of individual freedom. And the moderate stance is that abortion is allowable in scenarios involving rape, incest, when a mother's life is in danger, and during that first trimester of pregnancy. All right, that is it for Chapter 11.